computer, and now we're recording. I'm with Professor Jade Schiff of Oberlin College, and with Jade, we're going to talk about what it is to do political theory. I've known Jade for a few years, and I first really was introduced to her work, her fantastic book, Burdens of Political Responsibility. Am I using the correct pronoun?
Yes.
Good.
You are.
And wait, should I start over? Do you want that in the recording?
You know what? It's actually nice, I think.
Okay. All right. So
yeah, it's a good model for how to deal with trans folks. So
excellent. Good. I'm glad I got that right. That was not scripted.
No, I did not think so.
All right. So Burdens of Political Responsibility is this fantastic book that at first I don't remember how I came across it. I think someone had recommended it to me, and it really helped me a lot when I was thinking about responsibility, and I still am. And I'm delighted that Jade is with us today to talk about what it is to do political theory and to think about some of the methods types of questions that we rarely ask as theorists, and certainly I don't think write about very often. So why don't we start? Jade, why don't you tell us sort of an opening what you think it means to do political theory?
So I guess unsurprisingly, I think it means a few different kinds of things. I think there is a kind of, there's the sort of political theory, which I also do, that kind of gets at, what is this thinker trying to say? What's their argument? How have other people cast that argument, and are they sort of getting it right? Or there's some kind of tension in the thought that kind of makes you think, well, this doesn't really go together. So then the question is, does it actually hang together? I guess to put it differently, there are two possibilities, right? One is it just doesn't hang together. The other is, how do we make sense of this tension as a kind of productive one rather than a sort of destructive one, right? It's the
what do you think? What does it mean for something to hang together? I mean, I think I know what you're talking about, but how do you explain that to somebody who's coming at political theory for the very first time?
So, there can be, so if there's a contradiction in the text, right? You see a contradiction in the text. The author says one thing here, one thing there, and it seems like those two things can't be true at the same time. So then, there's two possibilities. Either the author, is just wrong or made a mistake and there's a contradiction in the work that they didn't work out. Or that contradiction or apparent contradiction tells us something about what the author is trying to get at. So, there's kind of the, is it a mistake or is it a kind of symptom or sign of something that's going on in the argument?
I love that way. I've never thought of framing that way. I really love that way of framing, because it gives you a sense of, when you're reading a text, what sort of things you're looking for. What is not said in the text that either needs to be accepted, right, for the argument to make sense, and what do you need to accept in order to work through contradictions. It seems to be suggesting something which I feel so often hard to get across, especially in I think first year classes, is just the importance of close textual reading.
So if I could, it may or may not help to give a really, really brief example. So I'm working on this article on Arendt's essay, Truth in Politics. And there's this one part of the text where she says, rational truth, scientific, philosophical, kind of stands outside the world of factual reality. It doesn't have the fragility of factual reality. It's not, it sort of stands apart. It's kind of like what Plato was talking about with the forms. It's abstract. It's up here. The world is, down here. In The Human Condition, which is another one of her major texts, she says everything human beings come in contact with becomes part of their condition. So that everything, to me, has got to include rational truth if we take her seriously. So then the question is, what does it mean to come into contact with rational truth? And if we can, and if rational truth somehow becomes a part of her condition, a part of our condition, then there is something going on in the truth and politics essay that's not working.
So that
Or
raises
that
a really interesting question, which is, so one of the things that we often distinguish with our students are, explanatory versus normative types of work, right? And so you've identified this tension, right, within Arendt's work, and look at these two different texts, and two significant texts as well. It's not like you're trying to digging through her journals and things. Like, these are two significant texts, and you've identified this contradiction. What's the point in highlighting this? I mean, is this telling us just something additional about Arendt, or is it saying something a bit more than that, that's of interest and of some kind of, I don't know, intellectual or other value?
Well, I think it's saying both, and it's perfectly valid to just say, look, this is this thing that Arendt says that's actually more complicated than we think. That's fine. But what I like to do, and the way I like to use theory, is to use it to illuminate something about the world, something about politics. I think that's when theory gets interesting. That's when it gets effective. That's when we can really that's when we're doing something with it. And so in this case, for example, I think reading that essay, and particularly that question in the context of the pandemic, is really interesting, right? Because what we see in the pandemic is essentially the politicization of science, the bringing of rational truth into the realm of politics. And I want to muddy Arendt's claims about the distinction to make sense of that, to say that, we see this thing happening and we can use Arendt to make sense of it. But when we do that, we also, that's what exposes the tension in her thought. That's what exposes what's wrong with the claim that rational truth has nothing to do with politics.
So it seems that part of what we do as political theorists is reveal something which is there but hidden.
Yes, or there but hidden, or there. I prefer it to the language of hiddenness. I prefer to think of it as we're missing a conceptual tool. That there's something we can bring to bear to highlight, to look at this thing. And because I think when we don't see something, there's two ways to look at it. One is it's hidden. The other is that there's something about our conceptual schema, about our approach, that makes us unable to see it. So it's the difference between hidden and visible, I guess.
And that last point about something in our I think in our condition, or there's something that we're already attached to that is making it difficult or impossible for us to see something. I think that's so key. And then I guess the question which I would have as an educator is, how do I help others develop that skill within the context of theory?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, one of the ways I start with this, and I teach a course called Justice, Virtue, and the Good Life. And one of the points of that course is to both kind of understand what we mean when we use those terms, and also the sort of their political significance. How do claims about justice and injustice, virtue and vice, work to sort of as a sort of work to include some in political community and exclude others, the virtuous versus the vicious, right? So where I start, I find it useful to start by meeting students where they are. So, I used to start by asking them to just define justice, and that was not helpful. I mean, for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons that it isn't helpful is that they haven't yet gotten used to the practice of conceptual definition. The way that I like to get at it is for them to look at the practices, look at the context. Where do we use claims of justice and injustice, right? If I say, I don't know, um, the Trump, Trump's immigration policy was unjust. The question is, what notion of justice am I appealing to? What do I mean by justice when I say that? And that gets them both to think about the ways in which they use terms like justice and injustice, and allows them to move from the realm of political claims to the realm of conceptual analysis. So what is the understanding of injustice, justice and injustice that underlies how we think, talk, and do politics?
But you're not doing this from the perspective of using syllogisms or, kind of kind of a Rawlsian or contract tradition, right? When you're thinking
No. And I'll be completely honest. I find that stuff antiseptic and useless. I think that you may or may not want to put that in there.
No, let's keep it. Let's go for the controversy, because I think there is a book. I don't have it at home, so I can't show you. It's in my office, which I can't get to. COVID, but there is a book on methods in political theory, and it's all analytic, right? I mean, and I think the reason it's all analytic, or 90% of it is analytic, is because it's relatively straightforward to explain how you would deploy analogies or syllogisms or whatever else, right? Or create a rule and then figure out how that rule functions, right? And then try to apply it. And I forget who it was, who said it, but I think the most dangerous place anyone can ever be is in an analytic political theory paper, because something absolutely terrible is going to happen to you, right? And that example is then going to be the basis upon which you can determine or decide, right, what is justice, what is not, right? The different ways in which you get killed or maimed or something.
Right. I mean, for me, the reason that doesn't work is politics is messy, right? The messiness is kind of written into it. So to take a method, the purpose of which is to kind of clean it up and put everything in neat categories, to me, can't tell you anything about the phenomenon, because it's a messy phenomenon, right? Why would you, I find it, I find it useless for thinking about politics.
And how do you then go about doing it, right? If you were to provide a contrast to those approaches?
Well, I think part of the contrast is this one that I've just described, moving from sort of practice to concepts, uncovering rather than saying, here's what justice is, and we can see it over there, saying, it's clear from, or clear might be a little too strong, but we can look at the way people think and talk about justice. We can look at practices surrounding justice. And from that, we can see, what we mean, or what some people mean when they talk about justice. Now, once we've done that, we can say, what's wrong with that conception of justice from a, normative point of view. But it doesn't, to me, make any sense to say, what is justice? Here's a definition. I mean, I guess the other way to do it, which I take to be kind of the analytic move, is here's a definition of justice. Here's a bunch of cases that show that that definition doesn't work. And, that's fine, right? Logically, if you have a bunch of cases that don't fit the definition, there's probably something wrong with the definition. But that doesn't tell you anything about politics. So that doesn't tell you anything about lived experience. It doesn't tell you anything about what it's like to do politics.
So when I was writing my book on the Jewish diaspora in Israel, and that book actually precipitated I think it was published before the workshop where we met, and in Jerusalem, we had a workshop on responsibility at the Hebrew University, and that's where Jade and I first met. And when I was doing work on the research, when I was doing for that book, it's called Obligation Exile, I was going around doing interviews, and I was asking, diaspora Jewish leaders in the United States and in the UK and in Canada and I did some interviews in Israel as well. I was asking these diaspora Jewish leaders, how do you understand the obligation that, we expect or think many diaspora Jews to have towards Israel? And one of the things that when I first did the first round of interviews I did in New York City, one of the things that became really evident was that using the language of political obligation was really problematic, because the definition of it that you'd get in the literature was so far removed from anybody could understand that. And not only that, the way I was trying to use it didn't fit neatly with how the literature did it. And in the one political theory book that I'm aware of, a book by I think it's George Klosko, where he called Political Obligation, he actually did do some interviews. And one of the things that came out of these interviews was that the way in which people were defining political obligation was completely removed from how it's used in the literature. And, I sort of feel at that point, I probably should have completely changed the framework to the research project, but, once you're in, but it speaks to what you're just saying, right? About, the importance of how people experience, the world they find themselves in, then using those experiences as your starting point. I guess the counter to that, though, is then how do you know when someone really goes off piste, right? So instead of asking what is justice and say, maybe ask what is racism and why is that wrong? What if you're asking that to somebody who's already a racist?
I'm not sure I understand. Is the question, is the problem that
the problem arises particularly, I think, with not just with students, but also, one of the accusations in a lot of literature is that if you're focusing on experience, there's no baseline, no foundation in which you then say this is right or this is wrong, because
right.
it's always only how people experience the conditions they're finding themselves in. So it's right to them, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's right to anybody else. So how do you distinguish, across different, competing normative claims?
Right. I mean, I guess that the first, in response to the first part, which was, people don't sort of understand, racism, like people don't understand what racism is in the same way, or maybe don't understand it at all. Was that sort of the first, was that the situation you're describing?
Well, I think that the question is about, a lot of theory, I'd say all political theory is going to be normative in some way, right? And if
Right.
you're looking at questions like justice, or questions of the right community, or whatever language you want to use, right? There's going to be some position about how we understand those normative conditions.
Right.
And one of the ostensible benefits of using a rule-based approach is that you can then set that definition. And presumably that definition is true universally. But
right. But the thing is, it never is, right? I mean, the definition may be true that you use to adjudicate claims of justice, but who cares if it's not the language that people are using to talk about it, right? And if the question is, how do we find sort of a standard by which, an agreed upon standard by which questions of justice and injustice can be judged, the answer is we don't, right? We find maybe contingent, intersubjectively agreed upon conceptions of justice that get challenged and reworked and rethought over time, right? But I mean, that's, to me, that's the answer. The answer to what do you do, what do you do without a sort of agreed upon conception of justice? Well, I think sort of historically what we see is you muddle through, right? You muddle through with a lot of violence, a lot of suffering, a lot of, I mean, but you don't get rid of that by imposing a definition of justice. What you get then is arguments about what justice is.
I think that's so important, because it's, there's, I feel a tendency, within so many of us, and often so many contexts, to try to find that universal rule, right? That then just resolves the problem, or which you can then judge everything. And I think there's something important about just embracing it, that it's okay for that rule not really to exist in the way that we want it to, and to muddle through.
Yeah, and I also think, I mean, I think it's I think there's a conceptual problem. I think there's a political problem. I also think there's an intellectual arrogance, right? Why the hell should we start from what I think justice is or how I define justice? What right do I have to organize a conception of the world on that basis? I don't have any more right to a conception of justice than you do, and we'll probably disagree on what it is. But the idea that we can establish a standard by which to judge the rightness or wrongness of practices as political theorists seems to me to just be both sort of wrong and the arrogant. I think the what I like about the approach of starting, as it were, from the ground up is I think it comes with a certain humility. It says, let's see what's going on here and then start thinking about it, rather than sort of developing some concept that may or may not have anything to do with the reality of what's going on, and then impose it, right? It just doesn't make sense to me to do theory that way. I don't think you get good theory that way.
So I think that brings us to maybe what could be our last question, or at least departure point, which is, we're talking here about, about issues, whereas we started and we're talking about texts. And do you think that there's a different approach to looking at a specific issue as opposed to engaging in a particular text? So let's say I did want to write about justice, right?
Right.
And I think, okay, so how do I do this? We started, it was here, we look at an author and see, okay, what are the contradictions or not in a text? But if we're looking at an issue, how do we go about doing that?
I'm not sure, so I'm not totally sure I understand the question. So it's a question it's the difference between looking at a contradiction in the text and looking at some kind of political issue.
Yeah, so if you give assignment to a student, right? And let's say one assignment is very text specific, right? But another assignment is not as obviously text specific, it's subject specific, right? So it might be, explain or, I don't know, provide an account of justice or something. I mean, it's kind of a big topic, but if there's something like that where you're dealing with a normative issue and you're saying, okay, you need to defend a normative position.
Right. So, I mean, the first thing I would say, and this is not meant as a criticism of you, but as a criticism of the practice. There is no way in hell that I would ask a student to define justice or freedom or virtue, because because they won't learn anything from doing that. I don't think.
Really interesting. We got to pursue this. So, because I mean, I've never asked on an essay, what is freedom? But I'm sure I've seen essay questions that do this.
Right.
Right. So you're saying, you wouldn't do this because so say a bit more about why you wouldn't ask that question.
I wouldn't ask that question because, well, first of all, I just wouldn't. The first reason is just, I think it would be insane to expect of an undergraduate student, or even of a graduate student, frankly, to be able to build a conception of freedom from the ground up for the purposes of writing a paper. I think that's just crazy as an expectation. The other reason I wouldn't do it is because it's the other reason I wouldn't do it is because I don't think there's ever one answer to those kinds of questions. Like if I wouldn't ask what is freedom, say. I would ask, in the context of, say, the civil rights movement or liberation movements in South America or Africa or whatever, what kinds of conceptions of freedom are at work there? And what is appealing and what is limited about those kinds of conceptions? I don't, and from there, I think it's possible to say a little bit of something. I think you have to say a little bit of something about what freedom is, if you're going to say what's wrong with this conception. But I guess to put it much more succinctly, I would ask them what is wrong with this conception as a way of getting them to start thinking about what freedom is, right? I think you have to start with a problem. That's what I would say. I think my approach to political theory is problem-oriented, whether it's a problem in the text or a political problem. I don't see any point from starting up here. Because it doesn't start from politics, and I don't see why you wouldn't start from politics.
Yeah, that's such a fantastic way, I think, to conclude, and or at least almost conclude. And it, I certainly find it's in some ways it's easy to come up with answers, and I'm repeating what a professor told me. It's much harder to come up with good questions, and identifying, you put it, problems or perhaps puzzles, right, and then trying to make sense out of them, or develop a greater understanding of an issue by engaging in those problems or puzzles, I think is something that probably animates most research in politics.
Yeah, that's, you just said, I think you just identified what it is I want to accomplish in my teaching maybe better than I have, which is that I want students to be able to find problems, to see problems. I tell every class I've ever taught, look, if you come out of this class with more answers than questions, I don't think we've done our job. What I want to get them to do is see problems, ask questions, have puzzles. And, I think that's where you got to start. So teaching them where to start, I think is for me, the most important thing.
Well, that's great. I think that's a fantastic point to end on. Thank you so much for your time today, Jade. It's been a real
pleasure, Elon. Thanks for inviting me.